thank you for this great opportunity. I get the chance to interview one of my good friends and fellow artist, Masimba Hwati. My name is Mayela Rodriguez, and I actually had the honor and privilege of doing an MFA program in the same cohort with Masimba. And so I'm just really excited for a chance to talk to you, Masimba, about your work, how it's progressed since we graduated, what you're thinking about with this new piece, Ngoromera. So without further ado, I want to just allow you to quickly introduce yourself.
Thank you, Mayela. So my name is Masimba Hwati. I describe myself as an interdisciplinary artist. I work across different mediums, chief of which is sculpture, sound, and performance. And yeah, I'm excited to be talking to you, Mayela, because you have experienced my practice, I think, at the most important time, I think, because this is the time that is producing this kind of work that we are talking about. So it's good to be conversing with somebody who has some background of what I'm doing.
Great.
Yeah.
Well, I think,
Yeah.
if you're ready, we should just jump into it. If,
Oh, yeah,
you
yeah.
wouldn't mind describing the piece, kind
Okay.
of what somebody might be looking at when they view the piece.
Mhm. So first of all, I want to talk about the title a little bit. So Ngoromera is an old Shona word which means fight. People don't use it as often, but that's what it means. It means fight. So the piece is a sculpture that hangs from the ceiling, and it's made up of a couple of brass wind instruments, several types of trumpets, and it has chimes, it has some bells on it, and it has a double-edged spear, and it makes a sound. It makes a very haunting sound. The sound is like a drone. It's like a drone trumpet sound that is layered. So yeah, that's, in a nutshell, that is what the piece is all about.
Right. And then, being really familiar with the work that you were doing when we were in school and kind of how that shifted from prior to more of the object-based work that you were doing. I'm really curious to hear more about how you think about it both as an object in space and then also how it's meant to be engaged with, because you said it makes a really haunting sound.
Yeah.
Who's activating it? What is that experience around the performance like?
So there is potential for the piece to be activated by several people or several performers. In the meantime, I'm the only one activating it. So it's always been an interesting thing for me to activate my work. As far as 2006, I've always been interested in sound and performance. So it's been coming in and out of my work, but not as much as I wanted. I think I didn't have the courage to engage with my work at that level. But the past 3 years have given me the opportunity and the experience to be able to explore and experiment with that. So when I look at performance and sound and sculpture, it doesn't feel like separate things to me. They might be separate states, in which the work is existing, but it really feels like one thing to me. And so I think I in the meantime I blow into the work by use of several mouthpieces that are attached to the work, and I have a small sound processor that is processing the sound. But there is a big potential that I am going to be working with different performers, because there is a way that different people can activate the work. Yeah.
Right. I think that there are a couple of really interesting things that you're bringing up. So kind of going back to the title of the work and the idea of fight, and then this thought of activating it, that it comes alive. I see a lot of connection there, which is really exciting. And I kind of want to hear more about how that idea of, this word Ngoromera and fight becomes present not only in the object, but when it becomes activated. Because I think what's really always been captivating about your work, and you kind of allude to this as well, is that it can kind of, as an object, exist and exist as a project, but when it's activated, it's almost like a new state that it's in, and I'm really fascinated by that idea.
Yeah. So the idea of Ngoromera for me, which is fight, started off when I got thinking about how to struggle or how to negotiate with power or with powerful systems. And having seen a lot of struggle myself as an individual and as part of collective communities, I'm constantly thinking about how to engage with power, and how to negotiate. I used to use the word resistance a lot.
Yep.
I don't use it much now, because to me, resistance is more of a negotiation right now. And in all my work, I think as resistance, maybe in an electronic sense, whereby resistance is the ability of a medium to allow or disallow a currency. So I don't really look at resistance as abrasive or confrontational anymore. There are reasons for that. The simple reasons are, when you are occupying a weak or a subaltern position, you really have to calculate, the cost of resistance and the cost of engagement. So negotiation for me is like the best way that I have seen. That's why I become more interested in sound anyway, because sound moves like that. Sound moves around things, sound moves through things. Sound moves with things. And so I'm really thinking about the idea of fighting in a different way now, and how more strategic ways or more insidious ways can become part of struggle or part of fighting. I think to me that's negotiation.
Right.
So when I really think about fighting in the context of my work or struggle, it's more of negotiating for space, negotiating for power.
Yeah, I think that really resonates with me, and thinking about sound too, as a negotiation, that there's a action and a reaction that kind of reverberates. And then I love that what you're saying is that there's that energy of the idea of fighting, where fighting has that energy, and then resistance versus negotiation. Resistance makes me think of friction, makes me think of like a losing of power, a losing of like something being taken away because of that friction. Whereas negotiation kind of recenters or recaptivates or kind of protects that power too. And I get this sense of like almost like a leveling.
Yeah. And what's interesting about this sculpture too is the form of it, where you have like very sharp spears and brass trumpets, So the combination of these, it's almost like a contrasting of musical aesthetic and like a military aesthetic, But I've come to see those things as one form of the other, as they kind of work together. There is a long history of how sound has been used in military campaigns, in colonizing campaigns, from the time of Napoleon when he invaded Egypt, you know, how he would move with sound scholars and how he invented brass instruments and how people use sound anyway, even in the protests that I have had the opportunity to experience at home in Zimbabwe. Sound is a big part of it, you know. So I'm really thinking of sound as a way or as a way of negotiating, you know, using the actual sound itself, but also thinking and moving like sound, you know. So yeah, it's an interesting phase for me right now in my work, I think.
Would you mind kind of diving in a little bit deeper on this idea of moving like sound?
So I'm very fascinated with sound studies right now, and there's a deep connection between sound studies and subaltern politics or minority politics. You know, I think the basic idea is when people do not have the privilege to openly confront a system or power, what do they do? You know, how do they engage? You know, they negotiate and they find ways around power. They find ways of modifying the power, you know. And these ways usually do not look confrontational, and most of the time they produce the same results of liberation. So when I talk about moving like sound, I am really thinking about the way sound is always moving away from the source, you know, and it's always wrapping itself around things, going through things, moving with things. It's very, very fluid. It changes form. It takes the form of the architecture. You know, so there's a very big aspect of improvisation, you know, which is very, very common in protests or in movements where people are trying to negotiate for space. Improvisation is key. You have to adapt. You have to adapt to the political situation, to the architecture, to the antagonist, to each other, you know, things like that. So I think just going deep in that sense of thinking, you begin to see that sound studies helps people to really think of how to approach conflict or how to approach powerful systems and how to negotiate with them.
That's really great. I kind of want to take it, you mentioned it right now too, and you had mentioned it earlier, this idea of your experience, you know, observing these protests that are happening in Zimbabwe and like these a very particular context that's happening there, and then currently in the United States, which is, you know, you're in South Carolina right now too. There's a different type of unrest that's happening in response to kind of the African diaspora. I'm kind of curious to know how these events kind of inspire your work or come alive in your work, maybe are manifested within your work.
Yeah. So as an artist, I'm always thinking of, you know, the political things around me, and I usually channel that in my work. I think through that. But for this particular piece, Ngoromera, I don't have a particular event or movement in mind, but I would say that I am deeply influenced, or I was deeply influenced by the events of November 2017 in Zimbabwe, where we had a military coup. So that period from August to November in 2017 was something that we had never seen before in Zimbabwe. We had like the biggest mass citizen uprising against the government. I think this was the first time in a history of suppression, when people actually went out and said, we are not going to be violent, but we are going out in numbers in the streets, you know. And to me, that made me think a lot about sound, but also about listening, because sound studies and sound thinking has a lot to do with listening, and when power doesn't listen, it pushes people to the edge. So I think one of the things that I do in my work is I try to teach I try to teach my audience how to listen. I try to reactivate that sense of listening. So I activate the sculpture, but I'm also activating the audience to listen, because I think there is a difference between listening and hearing, and listening is very intentional, and you have to be activated to listen. So that's why sound has become a very important part of my work, because I think that's something that we need as a society across the globe right now, is to be able to engage with that sense of listening.
Completely. Yeah, and I think something that really adds to the work on that thought of listening too is the sound is, in a lot of ways, knowing your work personally. I've always resonated with the idea of the sound and the event around producing the sound as the work, as it's the complete work. But I think what's so fascinating too is that you create these objects that are these amalgamations of items, and some that are really recognizable, like to reference back to previous project, like using a Smurf, for instance, or in the case of Ngoromera, a trumpet or a horn, like we can recognize that, or even a spear. I think what's really captivating about the work too is that you have performers force these objects to create sounds that we don't recognize. And I think that there's something really exciting about that, because not only are you listening to the sound, but you end up kind of listening with your eyes as well.
Yes.
I don't know if you've ever thought about that, but
yes, indeed. And also you are listening to the object.
Yes.
So it's always been an interesting process to watch how people engage with objects that make sound, but maybe in an unconventional way. So you see that even in Ngoromera, the sound that comes out of that piece is not like a conventional trumpet sound. It's haunting. It's set in a way that it will engage with a certain sense. Sometimes even the body of the trumpet itself is making sound. It's not only coming out of the barrel of the trumpet. Even the tip of the spear is making the sound. And usually it's a slightly uncomfortable sound. The point is just to be able to activate people to engage into this listening mode, because we have a familiar kind of range of listening. But when you begin to introduce different sounds, I think what it does is it helps people to really engage out of their ordinary sort of like spectrum of listening. So I like the idea of listening to objects and listening with your eyes.
Yeah, and I definitely see that relating to the idea of negotiation too, that there's kind of an attention that you have to give that's being required.
Exactly.
You've kind of talked about this, the idea of the audience being activated in certain ways. Is there kind of a, it's always interesting talking about the audience and what we kind of hope for them to get. Is there anything that you hope kind of registers for them, or like that they might experience when seeing the work?
This reminds me of the question, like, who's your audience?
Yeah, exactly.
Which is a very, very difficult question. It's always a difficult question for me. But what I hope, especially with this work, for the audience, is, as I said before, the activation of that sense of listening, to get people's attention or to draw people's attention to some of the sounds that they don't really consider or that they don't really perceive, you know. So, yeah, I look forward to really sort of like introducing people to a new place of listening, hopefully. Yeah.
That's awesome. That's great. Yeah, having the pleasure of hearing some sound bites of it. You use the word haunting, and I think that's a great way to describe it. And it, I think it's a piece of this moment, definitely. And I think it also draws upon this history as well. Like there are a lot of. It feels like it's situated in this really nice context that mixes past, present, and future. It feels very timeless in a lot of ways. Even aesthetically looking at the object, it's kind of hard to tell how it's even installed, for instance. The fact that it's kind of hanging.
Yes.
And then it just has that haunting, resonating sound. Just makes it feel like it's its own time and place.
And I'm glad that you referenced the hanging part. I think that's a very important aspect of the work, because it's literally negotiating itself between being on the ground and being on the wall or being on the roof. If I had my way, it would actually suspend without any help. That was the idea, to have something that is levitating, to really sort of like drive home and think about the piece as negotiating space.
Yeah, and I think that you definitely, there's the word that comes to mind, for lack of a better term, is suspense, and it's literally suspending.
Yes.
Yes. And there's something that's suspenseful about the idea of it can be activated, and it it has been activated. And so there's just this really nice tension around that, like that it requires a moment for it to come alive.
Exactly. Yeah.
That's great. I'm looking at something that you had written, and I'm kind of curious to know, maybe as like an ending point for this conversation. I'm going to read it, and would you mind kind of talking a little bit more about it? I feel like
For sure.
It's come up a lot in this conversation, but I kind of think it might be a really nice ending point to our conversation. So you wrote, "I'm fascinated by the way people operate like sound, in the way they structure and configure themselves around dominant powers."
Right. So that's a very personal statement. As much as I see that statement in action around, in my life, but it's also very personal. That's how I deal with power. That's how I deal with, let's say, maybe, for lack of a better term, oppression or repressive systems. I configure myself around it. I try to find ways around it. Or maybe I'm looking for a chink in the armor, and I'm trying to exist in a way that I modify that power. One of my favorite theorists is Akili Mbembe. He's a theorist, post-colonial theorist from Cameroon. And he, in his book, The Post-Colony, he says that when people deem a power as incontestable, they dance around it or they play around it in order to modify it where they can. I just paraphrased him. But the idea is that people, when they don't have enough resources or enough privilege to confront something, they move around it, they dance around it, they play around it, so that they modify the power of that thing. So the idea of struggle and resistance for me as an individual has always been like that. It's like sound. It's like the way sound moves. Sound doesn't really confront. It goes around. It weaves itself around. It goes through. It sometimes it envelopes. Sometimes it goes through the cracks or the gaps. You know. So coming from Zimbabwe, the political situation is different from here, obviously. I see people move like sound a lot. I see people think in very sonic ways. And right now, amongst Zimbabwean theorists, there's this interesting thinking that is coming up along the lines of sonic resistance. And it's fascinating to see that I'm not the only one thinking of sound. You know, there are a lot of people right now writing and thinking about sonic resistance because they see the same thing that I'm seeing. So it's very interesting.
Wow, that's fantastic.
Yeah.
Are there any particular nuggets or inspirations within this contemporary conversation around sonic resistance that are really sticking out to you?
So one of the theorists that is really thinking and writing about sonic resistance is a guy called Mozechi Kowero. I've been following him for a while. So he has a paper that came out recently, and he is connecting the military coup in Zimbabwe that happened in 2017. He's connecting that to sound and to music. You know, he is really thinking of how certain music and sound that came out before the coup influenced the coup and the mass uprising, you know. But he is also going deep into the philosophy of the sound, not only the music, you know, because I think there is a difference between how I treat sound and how I treat music. I think they are two different things. So it's interesting to see how people are really thinking through ideas of sound and struggle. It's interesting.
Man, this has been a true pleasure, Masimba, just hearing you dive deep into your work and, you know, help me kind of understand it and understand how it exists in space. And so thank you deeply.
Thank you, Mayela. It's been a pleasure.